is recording.
Okay, great. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you for the introduction. As Andy said, my name is Dr. Diane Vargas, and I am currently a professor of counseling education at California State University, Stanislaus. I spent 15 years in K-12 education in a variety of positions, such as teaching, counseling, and administration. I have been doing research in the area of suicide prevention and awareness for the past 8 years. And this is my going on my 5th year working with the district to provide suicide prevention and awareness for our parents, as well as our teachers, staff, counselors, and administration. So I have been here all day and I'm excited. I always love to meet parents in the community. And do appreciate that you're here this evening to hear about this important topic to ensure that your students are safe and working towards a positive mental health for their future. As mentioned, I have my graduate students who will be graduating in May, yay. Some of them speak Spanish, and so when we get to the Q&A, once again, if there's any questions that you have that you don't want to ask in front of everybody else, we'll go ahead and pair you up with a couple students and move you into a breakout room so that you can talk to them and ask questions. I promise you they are amazing and are really well equipped to work with parents. So without further ado, again, that we'll do that in the end. If there are questions in the meantime that are general for the session, please feel free to put those inside the chat. And I'm going to just stop share for just a moment because my little chat went away when I started to share. So I do apologize for that. So for our agenda, I'm going to be presenting for about an hour. Again, if there's questions, throw them in the chat, but I'm primarily going to go over some suicide statistics and some current information that is actually coming out for 2020. We'll talk briefly about the teenage brain and how that results with risk factors, warning signs. We'll go into talking a little bit about a suicide episode so that if you see the warning signs in your child, you know what to do. We'll, of course, go over some protective factors. And then I'd like to end our session tonight really talking about what you can do as a parent and some little brief tips about how you can talk to your child. It's really difficult when kids are struggling. They generally don't want to talk to their parent. So I hope to leave you with at least some quick tips that you can use, starting tonight. And then, of course, we'll refer to some resources. And then your district will be providing local resources. Of course, you have your own community resources that do exist. And then, as I mentioned, we'll end with those questions that you may have. So anytime I do start a presentation or training on suicide, I do want to start with a disclaimer to say that the subject matter can be very daunting and very stressful for some, and it may trigger some feelings of discomfort or just various emotions, and it may not be related to suicide, but we're really talking about when somebody is in deep distress. And so we know with parents, it's, you love your kids so much and it's really hard to see them suffer. So at any time, please, take care, walk away from the computer if you need to take a break. Of course, we'll be here and I will be the last person on this evening for anybody that needs just some additional support before we conclude this evening. So I'm going to start with just a quick, short little video, and then we'll get into our content. Oh, sorry. Sorry, I clicked it off. Okay, I shared that video because for those of us that work in education, the most difficult thing that any of us would deal with, whether it's an administrator, teacher, or a counselor, is to show up to school and find out that we've lost one of our students to suicide. Suicide is the second leading cause of death, and I'm going to get into some of the statistics here, but it is also the most preventable type of death. And so again, I want to thank you for coming here tonight because this is very important for you to know, to be able to be part of that prevention effort, what we do in schools. We never want to, again, show up to an empty chair. So I'm going to just briefly talk about some of the statistics and just note that it takes a couple years, usually 2 to 3 years before statistics are released and confirmed. I do again have some preliminary data, but the most current information that's been confirmed is from 2019. And in 2019, nearly 50,000 Americans died by suicide, which equates to about 1 every 11 minutes. And 8.9% of our youth in grades 9 through 12 have reported that they made at least one suicide attempt in the past 12 months. There is, again, in 2019, 1.38 million suicide attempts that were estimated, and suicide deaths are 2.3 times the number of homicides. Homicides used to be the second leading cause of death in the age group we're going to focus on today. However, suicides have surpassed that by 2.3 times. In a lifespan of someone, their 10th leading cause, it does remain in that 10th spot. But what's the most concerning is when I started doing these presentations, suicide was the third leading cause of death. And it also was the third leading cause for children in the age bracket of 10 to 14. And now, unfortunately, it is the second leading cause for the age span across that 10 to 34 age span. We know that males account for 77% of suicide deaths. Women actually, or young teens, will attempt more often. However, males use more lethal means and therefore die by suicide more often. And then we also know that veterans do account for 13.5% of the deaths by suicide, and that constitutes about 7.9% of the adult population. And finally, the last statistic here is really the most alarming to me, that since 2009, suicides have exceeded motor vehicle crash-related deaths. And when I think about that, it bothers me because I know that there are more cars on the road. Right? We wake up in the morning and commute to work. There is a ton of people on the road. However, people are dying less of motor vehicle crashes. And why? We've made roads safer. We've made cars safer. So people are surviving motor vehicle crashes, yet suicides continue to increase. So what really have we done to make a concentrated effort to make sure that our kids are safe as well? So when again you look at this chart, I'm going to expand that just a little bit here. The number one cause of death in that age group that we're really focused on with your children is unintentional injury. And unintentional injury could, be things like a car accident, or they were working on the roof and they fell and didn't make it. It could have been also self-injury, where they were using it as a means to maybe cope. But the intent was not for suicide. But right under that, as I mentioned, we're seeing that suicide rate increase now in the ages of 10 to 14. So across the 10 to 34 age span is where we've seen the greatest increase as far as moving up into that second bracket. We are seeing now, since the pandemic, a larger increase here in the 25 to 34 range. And that's, again, some of the preliminary data that's coming out from 2020. So this is the data that has come out from CDC and also from Kaiser Family Foundation. There are a lot more Kaiser facilities, and so they are also tracking who is coming in and out of their emergency rooms. So again, this is not confirmed data, but preliminarily they are reporting that at the start of the pandemic, 4 in 10 adults showed symptoms of anxiety and depressive disorder, while there has been a larger increase in our young adults. So 56% of our young adults in the age bracket of 18 to 24 saw an increase of symptoms of anxiety and depressive disorder. And when we get to the risk factors, you'll see why that's so important. Anxiety and depression are some of the key underlying issues of people that have tried to take their life. The rate of suicide among ages 25 to 34, I mentioned we saw an increase by 5%. They are the only age group that saw a significant increase. So there's been increases across all the age spans. However, they saw what we would consider as significant, meaning a large amount. And then this one is really worrisome to me because this is, again, the area where we live in ages 12 to 17, right? Really the focus on middle school and middle school and high school, is that emergency visits for suspected suicide attempts have increased by 39.1%. And that was comparing our recent winter 2021 to the same period in 2019. So they just did a cross comparison winter to winter. And again, if you think about what happened over the winter break, for example, we had the Omicron variant was at its peak. A lot of students were getting ready to come back to school. There's also that added pressure and anxiety about returning to campuses and seeing friends. And then of course, with a new variant, that added a lot of stress for a lot of people. So focusing on suicide in elementary, although incidences of suicide are low prior to adolescence, it still ranks as the 11th leading cause of death in children age 5 to 11. I know working in our age group, a lot of the counselors that are in the room today are working with 10-year-olds and 11-year-olds where we've seen that increase in suicide attempts. So it is really not immune to even kids in the elementary level. And suicide is a leading cause of death among school-age children younger than 12 years old, and the suicide rate has increased significantly in Black children in this same age group. And then when I'm talking again, suicide ideation is really when students are thinking about it, they're contemplating suicide. They don't have a plan, they don't have all the warning signs indicating that they are going to make an attempt, but they're thinking about it and thinking about it often. We see the highest rates of that in middle school. And so again, I applaud your district for bringing this program to the middle school level because it's not just a high school problem, it really needs to be addressed in the middle school. But then when we go look into actual attempts or death by suicide, now we're seeing the increases in high school and beyond. So when we look at, one death, so when somebody dies by suicide, the other alarming thing is our attempts increase. So amongst our youth, again, in our age bracket, are 15 to 25 years old, there's 100 to 200 suicide attempts for every one suicide. And that's a lot of students. So really the exposure to suicide also increases or elevates their risk for making an attempt themselves, especially if they already have suicide ideation. And then for adults, especially 75 plus years or older, there's actually 4 suicide attempts for every one. 75 years plus has the highest rates of suicide amongst all ages. And of course, you can kind of think about 75, start to lose spouses and friends and family and, starting to feel kind of a little hopeless or helpless if you haven't been working, you've been retired for a long period of time. So that makes sense that particular age group would have higher rates. So when we look at teenagers, and this is one thing, again, that we teach all of our counselors to really pay attention to, is that adolescence really is the time when the teenage brain grows exponentially. When we're younger, it really focuses in on the lower stem of the brain, which is we call another word for survival brain, where we focus on, really surviving, eating, drinking, sleeping, right? So our body kind of automates that when we're very young. But as we get older, we have to start making our own decisions and start really kind of, growing up. And so the teenage brain really grows a lot during that adolescence. So from middle school on, it is rapidly growing until the full maturity of age 25. And so we look at, when we're working with students in counseling, we're really trying to manipulate the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for the impulse control, decision-making, planning, organization, and emotions come from the amygdala. So they work together with that prefrontal cortex, the amygdala and the prefrontal, to be able to control mood, which happens in the amygdala, and then prefrontal cortex is the outward, the outlook, and how they react to decisions and planning. And this is why when you have a middle school, a child, they're kind of all over the place. They can't really regulate their emotions very well. 1 minute they're happy, 1 minute they're not. And they don't make great decisions, right? And those of you that have a high school kid, you know that as well. Their rooms are a mess. They don't know where their homework is. They're really all over the place. And that is truthfully because their brain isn't fully developed. So those students that have the opportunity to, learn that there's setbacks in life, they learn how to make decisions under the guidance of an adult. They learn organization skills. They will develop that part of the brain quicker and therefore make better decisions overall. There's also a lot of research in the area of mothers that exhibit depression throughout their life will have an enlarged amygdala, which does affect the emotional response and survival. So again, when you're looking at depression, there's not that heightened need to survive. The body actually represses to conserve energy. And so for children that have a high level of depression, that's why you're going to see they're going to survive a lot more, and they don't have that sense of survival or meaning in their life. So let's jump over to some of the risk factors, warning signs, and protective factors. So risk factors are stressful events or situations that may increase the likelihood of a suicide attempt or even death. They're not predictive, right? So if you have some of the things on this list, we all at least probably have one risk factor in our life. It doesn't mean that you're going to end up being suicidal. It just means that the more risk factors, the more likely that is possible. Where warning signs is those early observable signs that indicate increased risk of suicide for someone in the near term, meaning they're seriously contemplating suicide as an option. And this can happen within hours or days. So it can happen very quickly. So it's very important, again, for us to catch those warning signs early. And then I'm going to talk about the protective factors, which are those personal and social resources that promote resiliency, and they reduce the potential risk for suicide or any other high-risk behaviors. So we'll go ahead and break them down by family, personal behavior, and then environmental social. So some of the risk factors for students is especially when students have a high level of loss in their family. So it could be death of a close loved one. We know we've worked with students that have lost a brother or a sister that they were close to, or even a mother or a father, even grandparents that they're really close to can cause that deep depression or anxiety about what's, to come, right? That kind of mortality thought. But also if there's multiple suicide or illness in a family, that also raises the risk that they may also start thinking about suicide as an option. Any disruptions in the family, such as a divorce, or I know dealt in recent years with deportation in our area, So anything or major family people leaving out of the house, or a family member maybe getting addicted to drugs, and kind of having to be isolated from the family. So any disruptions in that create a lot more anxiety for our students. If they've suffered abuse and neglect, they have a much higher risk rate for suicide, or at least thinking about it. Repeated TV coverage of tragedies and shootings, which unfortunately we're seeing all the time. I feel like every time I turn on the news, I'm like, okay, I'm changing it already. I just want to watch the weather and that's it, because it's really depressing. Or witnessing. It may not be that they suffered abuse, it could be witnessing the experience of family abuse or trauma. Family moving in and out, that provides less consistency, and kids need consistency more than probably as much as water and food and air to breathe, right? That consistency is very important for them for their security. Learning difficulties, we know a lot of students with learning difficulties become socially isolated from their peers. They're treated differently. They often have higher rates of bullying and harassment. And then of course, chronic medical illness. If any of you've been in the hospital, I know when I had my appendix out, I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna die in here. You just really almost want to give up. But if you know that your chances of living are very rare, that could be very stressful, of course, for a child, and seriously not want to go through that suffering. And then I mentioned mental health issues. So there's a lot of mental health issues, but anxiety, depression, and bipolar are the top 3 underlying mental health issues that we see when we look at, obviously, the statistics of people who have died by suicide and even in attempts. And then I mentioned the exposure to violence, and don't forget, it's not just TV, it's also social media, video games. And again, it's not just that they play a video game here and there. It's if they're consistently watching it and you're noticing a change in their behavior as a result of that exposure to violence, you really need to monitor and make sure that they're only watching those things or participating in those games very limited, and definitely being monitored. And then we have a group of students that are elevated for risk of suicide. So if you have students, again, with any mental and or substance use disorders, we know that substance use disorders, so not just substance use or abuse, but disorders where someone's drinking or doing drugs or abusing drugs or mixing on a regular basis, before that age of 25, there can be damage to their amygdala. And then therefore it does not work properly with the frontal lobe for good decision-making, coping skills, problem solving, which is key to preventing a suicide in oneself. So it is the number one protective factor that actually stops somebody from taking their own life. And we'll get into that when we get into the cycle of a suicide episode. And then also we have to be careful of students who engage in self-harm. We know that self-harm by itself serves many purposes and doesn't necessarily mean that someone is suicidal. However, there is a point where if students are doing it as a coping mechanism, and then that coping mechanism is no longer working, they may be more severe in their self-harm, and at any point it can switch to suicide ideation. We also know that if students make an attempt of suicide, they have a higher likelihood of attempting again. And the reason, if you look at any of the research, when you compare adults to youth, and I kind of always use the Golden Gate Bridge because they have interviewed many, many people that have jumped from the Golden Gate Bridge with the intent to die, but live to tell their story. And what they always describe is the second they left or let go of the railing, they regretted it. They knew right then and there their problems were not that bad and that they can be solved. It's like their life flashes and they realize they want to live. But for our little guys, they don't have that full amygdala and prefrontal cortex working the same as an adult. And so now they still got the underlying issues that got them there, right? The anxiety or the depression, or maybe some form of bipolar or some personality disorder. They still have that, But now because they're kids, they have that elevated embarrassment and shame, right? They feel bad. They know now that you know as their parent. And so they feel guilt because they made you sad. So there's a lot of additional emotions that are really going to be elevate them for that risk. I'm getting a request for the prior slide. Did you have a question about that before I move on? Let me go back to that. Did you have a question, Rosa?
It was the one prior to that one.
Oh, okay, we're in that. Then that was just the introduction to that. I'm not sure which slide. And I can go back at the end if there's something that you want me to go back to, just to not hold up where we're going. Okay, so the other thing is the out-of-home settings. So our students who are homeless or foster youth care, they tend to have higher rates because, again, they don't have that consistency and that support from, a family, a unit, even if it's just a single mom or single dad that has that consistency and love. They usually are coming from some kind of trauma or some kind of abuse to either forced out of their situation in foster care or maybe choose to run away and become homeless. We also know that American Indian and Alaskan Native students have a higher rate, especially those that live on a reservation, because they have higher rates of abuse, a higher rate of mental disorders, and also substance use abuse and drug abuse. So again, that puts them again in that 2 category place. And then finally, the one area of students that we are seeing the greatest increase is with our LGBTQ, our lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and questioning plus. These students are at elevated risk for the simple fact that they are generally harassed or bullied more often. They're usually rejected by family members and or their peers. And also the extra stressors of just dealing with the fact that they feel different than other students or than their straight peers. So we are seeing a great increase in LGBT taking their life, and that is across all age groups. And then students living with substance use disorders, usually, have more access, to alcohol and drugs. And once again, studying people that died by suicide, they found that 37.2% of suicide descendants tested positive for alcohol, 48.1% for antidepressants, which is why there's warning labels now on all antidepressants that they could cause an increase in suicide ideation, and 30% for opioids, including heroin and prescription painkillers. And unfortunately, the painkillers, a lot of them are ordering these things online. I have a lot of people in education, and they're asking kids when they get busted for drugs, where did you get these? Well, I ordered them online and they were delivered to my house. So the access is there to these things that we try to protect them from. And then also the reason for this is when somebody goes through a cycle of suicide, there's a moment at the very end where there's got to be a level of impulsivity, because the body naturally fights for you to survive. Just like if you were sick, your body really fights it off naturally. Even though we take medications and vitamins and things, your body naturally tries to fight. And so when students know this, they don't have that impulsivity to take a gun to their head or jump off a cliff or jump off, the Golden Gate Bridge, for example. They take these drugs or this alcohol really to lower their inhibitions to be able to do that. So that's why we see an increase in students. So again, a huge warning sign if you see students' behavior change when it comes to drug and alcohol, because if you add those other risk factors, they are going to be at elevated risk. As I mentioned, our LGBTQ, their suicide attempt rates are 3 to 4 times their straight peers. Transgender youth attempts 4 to 5 times their non-LGBTQ identified peers. And they often use more lethal attempts. And I mentioned the rejection. They usually have increases of depression, anxiety. They deal really with a lot more stress than we do, which would be considered chronic stress. Again, dealing with the pressures from home and peers and schools to fit in. And then again, they're victimized more often than other students. And then rejection by family can increase by up to 8% for students living in this group. So I'm going to move you into warning signs, which is really the change in behavior or appearance that indicate that someone now is in deep crisis. And this will lead us into our cycle of a suicide episode. So there's internal signs. There's going to be somatic complaints. Again, the body is trying to survive. So they'll get a stomach ache from the anxiety. They'll get headaches from the tension, from the stress. The anxiety or worrying. We do know after, again, interviewing students that have made an attempt, that leading up to their attempt, they had sleeping problems or nightmares. Again, the body's natural way to say, hey, don't do this, almost in a way to scare them out of doing it. So in a sense, the body panics when they're at rest, right? So their subconscious is working. And then of course, if they're thinking, idolizing suicide or looking at, looking things up, looking at ways to die, those are definitely some internal signs that you may not see right off the bat. Agitation or just insomnia, they're tired, they're lethargic, and then they have boosts of energy. They are trapped and they feel like things aren't going to get better. And then hopelessness is a big one, because hopelessness is the last feeling that leaves a person's body. If any of you have watched a loved one die, I know I have watched family members die of cancer. And usually it starts with the doctor who says, I'm sorry, we're not able to do anything more for your dad or your mom. It's time to take them and put them on hospice or whatever. And even hospice will get to a point where they say, there's really nothing we can do. They have this much time. So people around will start to give up hope. And then at the very end, it's the person that dies that ultimately gives up hope in the end. And it is the exact same thing for people who are thinking about dying. Before they make an attempt, they have that last bit of hope that anything is going to get better. And again, because kids don't make good decisions, they don't have good problem solving skills, that is usually when that hopelessness really settles in. And we're really looking for the external signs, right? And so you're going to see this whether they're, pre-adolescent or adolescents. If they make a threat, we know, again, statistically, 90% of people who make an attempt on their life will warn or say their intention. They will warn somebody through way of posting things online. They'll put it in writing. They'll tell somebody. They might be very indirect, which I'm going to show you in the next slide. But either way, they've made a threat in most cases. So there is a handful of people that have died that there was no warning sign. Again, attempting the harm, again, once it passes through no longer coping mechanisms, or for other reasons that we're not going to get into tonight. But children often express their pain in writing, especially younger kids. And so the graduate students in here tonight do a lot of play therapy and art therapy. It can be wonderful for young kids who really don't have the words to express what they're feeling, but they're able to put that pain into a picture or into writing or into a painting. And then, of course, that uncontrolled anger, right? Middle school kids and high school kids are kind of crazy anyway. That's normal, right? They're developing still. But when you're seeing rage that just doesn't make sense, definitely there's something more internal that maybe you don't know about. Maybe there was a trauma. Maybe they're being bullied at school or outside of school, and you're just not aware of it. If they start, again, that substance abuse, so if they're starting to really mix things, mix drugs, mix alcohol, really at an excess, that's definitely, you want to get them in for help right away. And then a big one too that families really can pay attention to, first and foremost, is to know who your kids are hanging out with, because you want to be able to monitor when that might change. So withdrawing from friends and family, or society, or things that they used to love. So like maybe sports, things that they really enjoyed, if they're just kind of not into it anymore, really kind of explore that. If you're seeing that recklessness behavior, again, kind of experimenting drugs and alcohol, driving really recklessly, it may be that they're trying to attempt suicide without actually coming out and killing themselves. I know that sounds ironic, but in other words, they're hoping it just happens unintentionally, right? So remember that unintentional injury that I talked about earlier. Severe mood changes, right? So normal mood changes because they're adolescents and they're going through puberty, but we're talking dramatic mood changes where you're like, I don't even know who this person is. And or they don't come back to normal, right? They don't come back to what you know is normal in them. And then certainly a decline in schoolwork, grades, any of that. Alert the counselor, let them know that, hey, you know, what's going on? So-and-so had A's and B's. They are also trained to recognize that, to monitor that, because that's a true sign for us that we also know. But remember, we have large caseloads. So if you see it before somebody mentions it, you know, certainly communicate that back to the school. All right, so other things that I mentioned, the direct clues and less direct, right? So you may have that kid that's really direct and they just tell you like it is, but you might have a kid that's probably more often less direct. So obviously if they say things like, I wish I was dead, I'm going to end it all, I'm going to kill myself, they might just come out and say it. Those are, get them in, they need to go in for a full assessment. I would take them immediately to an emergency room so that they can get them into a proper assessment. If they're at school, we follow that same protocol. They might have to be 5150, meaning they might go involuntarily because we know that there is very imminent danger at that moment. But also pay attention to things like life's just too hard, right? Starting to settle into that hopelessness. You'd be better off without me. You know, make that very clear that that is not the case. You know, what's the point? What's the point of moving on? I can't do things anyway. Nobody would care if I'm gone, right? They say those things. Again, make sure you connect them to some counseling. Make sure that the school is aware, and definitely monitor. If your child is talking like this, they should not be left alone. These are direct and very less indirect, but still direct cues that you have a situation where a student may be making an attempt in the near future. And then, so there's some triggers that we look for. Again, this is going to go into the cycle of a suicide episode, kind of putting everything together that we just talked about. But we do need to monitor kids, you know, even a breakup. Pay attention to your child, right? I know Valentine's Day is Monday, so it's like the worst time of the year at school because kids are crying because they broke up, or so-and-so started to date somebody else. And I know middle school's a little young, but they do start to like each other and quote unquote date each other. So it is happening. Or it could even be a friendship. Maybe their best girlfriend decided she's going to hang out with other students or males. So any kind of breakup or significant problems in relationships, if they kind of bounce back and they're like, yeah, well, I really liked her, but you know, I'm good. I'll start dating later. I want to focus on school, right? If they're saying things that are indicating that it's a healthy way of reacting, then you're good to go. But if they're not coming out of their room and they're completely devastated and it's the end of the world, get them into some counseling, because now they're not really using good coping skills at that point, and really just a few tricks of the trade, we can get them back on board. Experiences of trauma, as I mentioned, impeding legal events, kind of going back to divorce or, you know, undocumented students. I know we're very worried about parents not being home when they came back home from school. That adds a lot of stress. Child custody issues. I mentioned previous suicide attempts, but also family members that may have died by suicide will increase that and may trigger a suicide in someone who has suicide ideation. You know, suicide of a friend is huge. We call it bereaved by suicide, or even that loss of a loved one. Again, if they've already got a lot of the risk factors and then one of these triggers occur, you really should make sure you're watching them and checking on them often. If they're withdrawing, again, I talked about family conflicts, we talked about chronic pain. And then these last three have to do more with students that may have gone through a substance use disorder program, and they relapse or they become re-intoxicated. Of course, if a child is intoxicated, again, they're not going to think nowhere near somebody that's an adult that's intoxicated. And so their decision-making skills are very low. So again, that relapse is very real, and it is very much like a suicide attempt that they survive. They feel the guilt that maybe they got over using this drug or alcohol, and then they relapse and they start doing it again. So they know they've let you down, they feel bad, they feel guilt, they feel shame. And so again, that's something that we really want to support when they come out of maybe a treatment facility or something like that. Okay, so putting all of this together, when we talk about a suicide crisis, we're really talking about the phases that one would go through right before making an attempt. So here you have, all of us, right, no matter what age we are, go through times of stability where, things are going well, we're feeling good about ourselves, we get to pay our bills, right? Things are happening the way they're supposed to, right? We're stable, things are good. But then at any moment, a crisis can start. As we know, right, the day of the pandemic, they said, we're shutting down, stay in your house, right? Crisis, that's huge. But for little guys, it could even just be that their girlfriend or boyfriend broke up with them. So that crisis begins, and as I mentioned, it could be hours or days. So it could be short or long, depending on how long they have really been suffering. But at some point, our crisis peaks, right? So I kind of feel like we are kind of over the peak with the pandemic. We're at least starting to come on the other side. But for our little guys that maybe, again, that breakup, that crisis, they're just stuck up in that crisis mode and they're not really coming down. They don't feel like they can get over it. But for the rest of us, that crisis diminishes and you go back to a stable mode. So when you look at it by putting together the risk factors, we know that seasons, being in a rural area where there's not a lot of access to resources, again, those triggers of child abuse, loss of a parent, all that trauma, being in LGBT, we talked about age, we talked about ethnicity with our Indian Americans, our gender. So bringing a lot of these risk factors to the table, and then you have one of those triggers occur, right? And so for kids, it could be dealing with a divorce. For adults, it could be going through a divorce, right? So major loss, all of these occur or affect our kids, whether they're happening to them or around them. Halt, hungry, angry, lonely, tired. If you have all four of those, I don't know about you, but I get a little crazy. So all of these things can really get them to that last straw. So that's what we call that last straw. That's that final trigger. And so what happens is most of us that have good coping skills, good problem solving skills, we don't contemplate suicide. We reach out for people that are our wall of resistance. We look to our protective factors. So we call a friend, we open up to our parents, we tell a teacher, we tell a counselor, we talk to somebody. But for our little guys that don't feel that they have that connection to talk to somebody, or they feel that nobody understands, that hopelessness settles in. And remember, hopelessness is the last feeling to leave the body. So they start to contemplate suicide as a real solution, and they really think about it. So if somebody steps in, the crisis averts, they come to the other side and stabilize. At any point, they could go back to that crisis peak. But if they don't have a wall of resistance, that is when they make a suicide attempt. Oh, I think we have somebody that's unmuted. I don't know if we can get that person muted, not sure. Anyway, so that attempt will be made if that wall of resistance is not there. And so again, it's really important that we recognize those warning signs so that we don't get them to that level of increasing hopelessness. Some other protective factors that we look at is, school climate, of course, for parents. That's, you obviously want a school that's very supportive of students. And this is especially important in our younger students. building that sense of self-worth and self-esteem. Kids do really well with pets early on because of the responsibility, and they have that duty to others, so it builds empathy. Reasonably safe and stable environment, as I mentioned, you don't have to have the perfect home. It doesn't have to be perfectly clean, but it needs to be stable and consistent. And then just connecting, right, with other family members, with peers. Do they have friends? Who, again, are their friends? Connection to school and trusted adults, right? It might not be you. I can tell you adolescents don't like their parents, especially in high school. And that's a normal process so that they actually leave the house one day and become young adults. But they need somebody. So even if it's their favorite teacher or their favorite uncle or their favorite grandma, whoever it might be that's a trusted adult, let them connect with that person. Don't take it personal. And then community, right? Some have great community resources, after school programs, places where kids can go to connect with others. And then protective factors we tend to see more in the older adolescents, again, is building those skills to think, to communicate what's happening, right? So it may still be play therapy, even in the older, might be, even older adults that have to write things out and journal. Communicating is a great skill to be able to say, I need help. Solving problems, managing anger, and any other negative emotions. So again, the purpose of value of life is huge. Again, going back to having pets, thinking about their future. If kids are optimistic about what's to come, they're generally more likely to be mentally stable and healthy. Personal characteristics, right? Staying healthy. I do know kids love sugar. It's like the only food group in the whole entire world. Trying to get them to at least get some sleep regularly, let them sleep in on the weekends. There is so much evidence that says that kids need, especially adolescents, need sleep because they're growing, their brain is growing. So let them sleep, still make them do their chores, but maybe you can be a little flexible about when they do them. So let them get that rest, make sure that they're eating and drinking water and that sort of thing. And of course, healthy choices, so monitoring what they're doing. Spirituality and religious beliefs are very good, again, for positive outlook and thinking really kind of beyond themselves, right? Because kids internalize everything. They think everything is about them, and it really isn't. So being able to think outside of themselves is really a key factor. And then I mentioned the supports and then the safe environment. And then finally with family, right? These are the things that we hope to build in you is really your connectedness to your children. And we're going to end tonight with some of the key things that you can do, little easy strategies that you can try. Being involved, and I don't mean just like showing up for their basketball game, but showing up to ask them, what did you do in school today? What's your schedule? What classes are they taking? What sports are offered at the school? Anything to really be involved and pay attention to what they're doing. If you do that early and often, then they're not going to make a big deal about it later. If you all of a sudden start asking them where they're at, they're going to be like, why are you asking me? Why, because you've never asked me before, right? That's kind of going to be their reaction. So try to kind of ease into it if it's something you don't normally do. But check in with them. Let them know you're there. Let them know that you're there to talk. You can talk to them at any time. Close friends or family members, caring adults, again, social supports. Parental norms. This is a big one that I know me personally, I struggled with when I was a counselor, is parents that were okay, especially when marijuana was legalized in California. Kids were coming to school high and they're like, well, it's legal. And we're like, but you're not even 18, first of all. And second of all, why are you at school high, right? So that shouldn't be a normal thing. But a lot of them said they got it from their parents. Or the access to alcohol in the home, right? Make sure it's locked, make sure it's somewhere they can't get. Yes, they can get drugs and alcohol everywhere today. Like I said, even on the internet, but don't make it easy for them at home. Make sure they know that you disapprove of that until they're of age. And then also your support for school. I know the pandemic made it tough, right? Everybody wanted to just stay in bed and not even face the world. But kids need to know that, no, you need to go to school, you need that consistency. So they need to be there, and then you need to support. Definitely, I can't say that the school is always right, but the school really does have the best interest of your students and want to make sure that your child is living their best life to graduate and go beyond. So some of the things, again, we want to first and foremost say take preventative measures, right? So you're not powerless. Interact with your team positively. You want to make sure that you give them consistent feedback and compliment them for things that they do well. Excuse me, sorry. So thinking about, there's a program that we have up here up north, and we focus on even the littlest thing that they did. If they put their plate in the dishwasher after dinner, praise that, just compliment. Hey, thanks for putting that plate away. I really appreciate that you didn't leave it in the sink. Or, hey, thanks for hanging up your wet towel, right? What am I doing? I'm actually telling them what I want them to do without having to nag on them and tell them what to do. Just start noticing the things they're doing right, and ignore some of those little things that are going to not drive you so crazy, right? So if the plate stayed in the sink overnight, is that going to be the end of the world? If it's worth your child not being anxious or depressed, it's probably worth the plate staying in the sink. So notice the things they do right, even if it's the silliest thing. They lock the door on the way to school, that they went to school for, if you have to get that desperate, right? So compliment them on things, notice things that they're doing right, because they like to hear positive things. They don't want to hear their parents nagging and be negative all the time. Again, try to increase their involvement in positive activities. That could even, clubs and sports, definitely in school, but even in your church or in your community, even with your family. Maybe you guys get together every Sunday and barbecue, right? Get them involved with other people. Don't let them just isolate. And monitor your teens' whereabouts and communications. I didn't put it in this presentation. I did have it in the earlier presentation when I was training counselors and admin, that there are students that are texting kids to kill themselves, that are posting terrible things about kids and each other on Snapchat and Instagram and Twitter. So you want to monitor that, because they might be suffering in silence about their harassment or cyberbullying that's going on. And it could be happening while they're sitting right next to you watching a movie Sunday night, and they're looking at their phone and you have no idea what they're watching. So again, make sure you pay attention. I'm pretty sure you pay for the phone, therefore you own the phone, right? You want a level of privacy, but you have the right to check on things. Know their passwords, that sort of thing, and let them know that it's really for them to make sure that they're safe. And then again, being aware of their social environments. Who are they hanging out with? And the only way you're going to know if those change is to really know who they have, who in their life, maybe it's questionable that they're hanging out with this kid. Make sure communicate with parents, meet the parents. Definitely, if you have a child they're going to go over to their house all the time, make sure you know where they're going, because they really might not be going to anybody's house, right? I know I did that once or twice as a teenager, right? I didn't really go to my friend's house. So know where they're at, right? Because they're going to outsmart you, I promise. Again, communicate with your team's teachers, ensure progress. Believe me, it takes a village. And if the teacher and you are on the same board about your child, they're going to be outnumbered, right? So make sure that they know that you know how they're doing in school, right? So talk to the teachers. If there's any drops in grades or assignments or even attendance, communicate so that they can stay on top of that and inform you. Again, be aware of access to alcohol, prescription drugs, illegal drugs. And also, if you have a student who is suicidal, you should be well aware of knives in the home, rope. I don't have that listed here, but unfortunately, that's a definite means that students use. And guns should absolutely be locked up, right? So you might be in a household where you go hunting on the weekends. That's perfectly fine, but make sure you're teaching your kids about proper care and then lock them up. Talk to them directly. Talk to them directly about suicide thoughts. Ask them. Come right out and ask them. I know that seems a little bit scary, but it actually relieves their anxiety if they are suicidal. If they're not, they're going to be like, "Are you crazy?" Right? They're going to give you an answer that's convincing. But talk to them about it. Ask them directly if they're thinking about taking their life. And again, don't put too much pressure on them to answer that in the moment. I'm going to talk about that in the next few slides. And I know we got about 10 minutes, so we're good. And then address again your concerns if you are feeling that you're not, getting that connection with teachers, but reach out to other family members, coaches, but definitely let your child's counselor know in the school so that they can also meet and check in with your student. And then you should also regularly talk to your pediatrician. If you have a doctor, you want to make sure that they can make mental health referrals if possible. Remember, everything is not physical, right? We have to take care of our mental health as well. And then there are times where you might be asked to put your child on medication. The one thing I will say, medication does work very well if it is prescribed properly. But if your child's going to be on medication, a good doctor will also pair that with good therapy. So just because they're medicated doesn't mean the issue went away. It means that it's under control. The therapy is going to help them control and change their behaviors. So those two together allow them to work in sync, right? So the medication gets them to a point where they can accept that change in therapy. So again, if your doctor just says, put them on this meds, I would highly caution you to say, could they get some counseling as well? Okay, so I'm going to talk in these next couple slides about how to talk to your child. So first and foremost, talk to your child, right? We said that on the previous slide, but timing is everything. Pick a time that you have the best chance of getting your child's attention. So maybe that's on the ride, to dinner. Maybe that's on the ride home from school. Maybe that's when they sit down on the couch to engage in a conversation, or they come into the kitchen and they're telling you something about something. Talk to them when you have that best chance to get their attention. And there's like in any other research looking at family, therapy, for example, where they say the biggest argument that men and women have is that usually it's the female will go into the garage when their husband is doing something, they're in the middle of fixing something, and they want to talk about their feelings, right? And the other person is just like, oh my God, are you serious? Right? Their brain span is not there, right? They are not right there to be able to have this conversation. So again, pick the best time that you can have a chance of getting their attention. This is one thing that students will say. I remember, I can't tell you how many students said this to me, that they're always accusing me of something. They're always telling me I did something wrong. So talk calmly in a non-accusatory manner, right? So you don't want to blame them. I know you were drinking last Friday, right? So you want to ease into that. I know that you came in late last week, and I just want to know, how did that party go? Was there drinking going on, right? Ask it not all in one sentence, but break it down and don't accuse them of drinking. Let them tell you what happened. Maybe but let them say it. Let them come out with that, right? And once you start that accusation, they're going to go into defense mode and they're going to shut down, and nothing you say is going to go in, right? It's going to go right out the other ear. So I feel this way. I think this. I'm concerned. Always start with that. It goes a long way. And then this is another thing that drives kids crazy, and they will shut down, is you talk and talk and talk. Kids got short attention spans, especially middle school. They're all over the place, right? You might have a high schooler that's all over the place. Start with something positive and get out. Go into the room. Hey, dinner's ready. We'll wait 5 minutes. Get out. Don't wait for them to get off the bed. Don't wait for that, right? Get out, because you'll drive them crazy and they're going to fight you back on this. So say something positive, like, oh, thanks for putting the towel up, your wet towel. I appreciate that you hung it up in the bathroom, and get out. Start planting those positive seeds, and what will end up happening is they'll start coming to you. Because what did we want? We crave that positivity. We crave that we're doing something and getting acknowledged for it. Kids thrive on the fact, right? Because everything seems negative to them all the time. So if you're just every time your interaction with them is happy and positive and hey, thanks for doing that, or hey, you did a great job, and just short and sweet and get out, then your conversations will get longer and longer and longer, but you've got to build up to it. If you walk into your child's bedroom and try to talk to them for an hour, good luck. If you already have that child that does that, great, amen to you. You should be part of this presentation because kudos to whatever you did correctly. But if you're one that your child just shuts down, be positive, short, and then you can get longer as they start coming to you. And then go back for the real deal when ready, right? So if you say something and you're like, I really need to talk to them about, I know they went to a party, right? Think about what you want to say ahead, rehearse it if you have to, because you might have that child that's going to come back with some smart remark, right? So it always helps to have that reference. So I was reading in the paper that young suicide has been increasing. Or, oh, hey, I saw your school is having a program for teachers on suicide prevention. Do you know anything about that? Or, oh, hey, I know that there was a student on campus that made an attempt. Do you know anything, or did you know that student? Right? So you're kind of gathering information without accusing them of anything. So think about what you want to say. What do you really need to know, right? If you go right in with the question, they're going to shut down and you're not going to get anywhere. And if it's a hard subject for you to talk about, just say it. Kids are like notorious for calling people out for lying or not being genuine. They, again, have, for whatever reason, at that time of your life, it's the most creative you will ever be. They are actually very intelligent, but it's more in a creative way. So they will pick up on your scary vibes right away. So again, I never thought this was something I'd be talking to you about, but I think it's really important. This is really difficult for me to talk about, or I know this might seem uncomfortable. I'm a little uncomfortable, but I really want to talk to you about this because it's important to me, right? If my mom said that to me, I'd be like, okay, Mom, what do you want to talk about, right? So admit that it's uncomfortable. And then again, ask for your child's response, be direct. What do you think about suicide? Is there something that any of your friends talk about? Have you ever thought about suicide? Have you ever thought about killing yourself? Have any of your friends talked about it? And then listen. Don't write that, that I know you guys probably saw that on Facebook. Listen, Linda, listen. Because then if you ask a question and then you keep talking, they don't get to answer the question. I see people, this is probably the biggest breakdown of communication I've ever seen, where somebody asks a question and they don't wait for the response. They just keep talking. Right? So ask the question and pause. Listen to what they're saying. Don't be listening to accuse them, right? So what you're telling me, a good way to do this, we do this in counseling, is just simply paraphrase back what they said. So this way you don't catch up by saying, I knew you drank last Friday, right? So when you ask them and they were nice enough to answer you, then you start accusing them, you're going to shut them down. So what happened at the party that made you drink, right? And then paraphrase that back to them. So what you're telling me is that's the first time you ever drank. Okay, well, you were experimenting. How did it make you feel, right? So what you're telling me, right? So you can just start practicing that. Every time they come out with something, repeat what they said, because again, they do talk in codes. Adolescents talk in code. And if you understand their code, bless you, because it's not always easy. And they talk in code because they don't want adults to know what they're saying. So repeat back what they're saying, try to understand it so that they can go, no, that's not what I said. And then let them explain it in a different way. And then lastly, do not overreact or underreact, right? So overreaction really closes off the future communication. Like I said, when I talk to students and they're like, yeah, I told my mom that I drank at this party and she freaked out, right? And I'm not just blaming moms, right? Dads do this too. They completely overreacted. They grounded them for a year, which is unrealistic, right? So don't overreact. And then you also don't want to, like, if they say, yes, mom, I'm really thinking about suicide, you don't want to underreact either. You want to go into, so how long have you been feeling this way? How can I help you? Is there anything I can do? Or is there anything anybody else can do? Right? Don't just go, oh, okay, darn, I'm sorry that you're thinking about that. Right? So make sure you stick with them, right? And get more information, and then check in again. Check in often. Short bursts, positive bursts, but often. So any thoughts or talk of suicide, you can always relate, right? They don't know everything about you when you were a teenager. I felt that way when I was a teenager, but I don't feel that way anymore. And some of the things I did that made me feel better was this. Or I know you're going through a tough time right now. I also have felt like I'm really going through it during the pandemic, but I'm here for you and I'm going to be here no matter what, right? Say things like that. And always be revisit, right? Always go back, always follow up, reassure them that that you are going to get the help that they need to be able to change that outlook for them. And remember that suicide is an attempt to solve a problem that seems impossible to solve in any other way. Ask about the problem that created the suicide thoughts. This can make it easier to bring up again in the future. So again, I wanted to ask you again about the situation you were telling me about. And then lastly, just make sure you are take appropriate action to protect your child. If you just feel things are not right, connect them to a counselor, outside sources, your doctors, especially if you've seen warning signs, if you know your child has a lot of risk factors. If you're lucky enough to have a mental health provider that's experienced in youth suicide, great, but get them no matter what to a mental health provider. You can always switch the provider later, get them into some kind of counseling right away. If the danger is imminent, call 911. Take it seriously. If your kid says, I'm going to go in my room and kill myself, break down the door. I'd rather you replace a door than not have your child tomorrow. Call 911, bust the door down first, though. If they go into their door and lock the room and they just said something like that, immediately respond. That is a time to overreact in that moment. And then again, communicate with your child's counselor. Again, if they are taking for an assessment, we have a hard time on the education side that sometimes you take a child over the weekend to the doctor, maybe they went in for a suicide assessment, and then they show up for school on Monday and we have no idea. So make sure you do contact school, let them know what's happening so that we can follow up with your child to make sure that they're doing and transitioning okay back to school. So these are some outside resources. Again, your counselor, your nurses, your school-based health centers, if you have them, crisis team members, administration, school resource officers, anybody else out in your community, connect with them. I've also included here the crisis hotline. It is free, so anybody can call. And then also there's some websites here that you can also go to. I'm going to throw those into the chat that also have great resources for parents. And then of course, there's also school resources that we use. And before we go to question and answer, just want to make sure that everybody does have my email. If you have any questions or follow up, maybe after sleeping on it tonight, if there's anything that you want to ask further, please reach out and let me know, and I'll at least get you connected with somebody that can help. So I'm going to open it up for questions, and I know somebody wanted me to go back to a slide, and I apologize, I'm not sure which one it was. So maybe you can unmute yourself and go there.
It was slide 13, Dr. Vargas.
Okay, perfect. Was it this one here?
Yeah.
I am getting a request in the chat. I'll just briefly touch on that because we do need to go into question and answers. But yes, there is a set of parents that do set unrealistic expectations on their child. And that is also something, I know even just being in your area, you do have some really, really high functioning students. And we do need to be aware of that. That also adds a lot of the additional stress on kids. I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation that I had a couple students that took their life, and I can tell you the second suicide was going to be the valedictorian of our senior class that particular year. He put a lot of the unrealistic expectations on himself, but in both cases, the parents were to the point where the child was just overwhelmed. Especially right now during a pandemic, you know, we need grace, right? We need maybe to step back a little bit. You know, adding pressure on your kids, they already have so much pressure. It's really not worth, you know, if they don't get into Stanford, it's not the end of the world. They can work their way to get to Stanford. But taking that info, you know, definitely understanding when your child is really showing signs of stress, that's a time to back off, not add more stress to them. So I can't emphasize that enough. I know you want them to all be doctors and lawyers, but that's not always going to happen. So be realistic about your expectation. Thank you, Lily, for answering that. Yes, I did put the resources and you can also write them down. So thank you, Lily, for catching that. I'm going to go ahead and open it. Actually, before I do that, if there is anybody that doesn't want to ask a question, I'm going to go ahead and stop share for a moment so I can see all your beautiful faces. If you do feel uncomfortable asking your question amongst everybody, again, I have my wonderful graduate students that are going to pair up and go into breakout rooms. If you could just maybe put your hand up or put your name in the chat, we'll take a few minutes to get you over into a breakout room. So it will take a little bit. So just be patient. And then also, if you want to ask a general question right now, we'll go ahead and take those as well. And Andy, thank you, or Andy, thank you. I see you're putting other resources in the chat as well. So any questions that we can answer that we didn't already get to? Thank you, Lucy, so much for translating as well. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Dr. Vargas, one of the questions I hear at some of our campuses are, what do you do with a student who is, you see that there's a problem, but they're in denial themselves, and so they become combative with you as far as maybe finding someone else to talk to or going to therapy. They may go to the therapy sessions, but they'll sit there and not talk to anybody. How can you assist with maybe having them comfortable realizing that there is a problem and you're just attempting to help them?
Great question. Does any of my students want to answer that question? I think that's a great question. And I know some of you have dealt with clients that shut down and don't talk. Do any of you want to share your strategies? And I'll go ahead and answer as well. But I know we got some bright ones. Don't be shy. Don't be shy.
Yeah, I can go ahead and say what I would do in this situation. I feel like something really important is just maybe not right away talking about the issue at hand, just getting to know the student, asking them what they're interested in, what they're passionate about, what do they want to do career-wise, how is everything at home, and just being a real friend to them can go a long way and help them open up eventually about what's going on.
Excellent, Christian. Excellent answer. So what I would say too is along that lines, if you've already taken them into counseling and they're shutting down, that might not be the right counselor. You know, again, I always encourage school districts to utilize their graduate students because they are working directly and they're so creative and they're you know, trying out different things as field experience students, and they come up with better ideas than me, I'll tell you. But just as Christian said, if it's not happening in therapy, it's just really building that relationship with them, and don't make it about the therapy. Keep in mind when kids are under a lot of trauma and stress, they may not even know how to express themselves. So, having them write things down, journaling, playing a game, right? You don't have to be an expert in play therapy to break out with, Monopoly or, checkers or something. Kids do feel less stress when the pressure isn't on them. When they're looking at a counselor and the counselor's like, okay, tell me about your feelings, they're going to shut down. So like Christian said, sometimes just finding out more about them and what they like is really a good approach. Did somebody want to add to that, or any other things that you guys have tried? Great question, Andy.
And what about special education students who may be having a difficult time with focusing on the feeling that they are experiencing? I know that we have a brief academy for our district, and sometimes there are students where they can't quite identify how they're feeling in order to give an adult the information they need to pick a path that best supports them.
Excellent, excellent. Does anybody want to answer that? So special needs students that are having a difficulty time expressing themselves and what their needs are.
Oh, you want to take it?
You go ahead.
Okay. Well, I used to work with children on the spectrum for autism. So sometimes what we would use is kind of like a visual chart. So sometimes if students aren't able to like talk about like what's the issue, or they're not able to like tell you what's wrong, we would come out with like a big old chart with like a bunch of happy faces, or like a special character that they like Mickey Mouse or something. And Mickey Mouse might be sad, might be happy, might be confused. And we would have like the student or the client, hey, like, how do you feel today? And make it like super nonchalant, like don't make it like, super about counseling, but you're like, hey, like, how do you feel today? And then they would point, and then just like, okay. And then we would work off that, like, what to do.
Excellent, Armando. Did you want to add something, Sal? And that's great. Yes.
No,
definitely.
that was basically it, because I haven't had to deal with that in special ed, but I do stuff in special ed. And a lot of times, like, especially kids that are nonverbal or not able to express their feelings or articulate them, we will use like a chart, just like Armando said. It would be like a happy face, a sad face, an angry face. And then we ask them, how are you feeling? And they are able to point towards how they're feeling. So that's one way to communicate with special need kids.
Excellent. Yeah, and then you can work from there, right? So if they're sad, then you can work on, why they're sad, and, walking around with them. Again, expressing themselves through writing or art they might be able to express it that way. Some of the darker colors that they might use might indicate some anger. If they're drawing a depiction of something happy, at least there's some kind of positive outlook, and things aren't maybe as bad as they might portray them to be. But yeah, charts and feeling charts, that at least will get you through. It is difficult, especially when you're working, like Armando said, on the spectrum, especially if they're nonverbal or they're really hard to articulate what they're feeling. You got to kind of start with those pictures and feeling charts so that you have a basis to start with. Excellent. Thank you both for sharing that answer. Okay. Oh, yeah.
What about resources for parents? Because dealing with the situation where you may have a child who's experiencing suicidal thoughts, or the stress themselves of how do I create a conversation that, one, will reach my child, and at the same time too, that I can personally deal with. What are some resources that parents or guardians can use for themselves?
Sure. Yeah, and that's a big thing that we want to make sure that our parents have to take care of themselves before we can take care of others. So that's really important. I'll open it up to my students, but I will just say first, make sure that as a district that you're getting that information out to local agencies where they can go. I know up north, we have in almost every town, we're lucky enough to have a family resource center that does provide services on a sliding scale and free of charge for some, depending on funding or what parents have as far as their income. And so if there is anything in your area that offers that, that would be a great resource as well to start there, because they do provide outside counseling. And then I was going to say also connect with others, right? Connect with other parents, see what they're going through and what strategies they're using. Remember, I said at the beginning, don't isolate. When you're going through something or your child's going through something, the worst thing you can do is isolate and suffer in silence. Get out there, reach out to people that you can talk to and share ideas. Students, is there anything you want to add to that? I don't know if there's any specific strategies or maybe websites or places you send parents, but that's always hard because they need counseling too.
I can add something. I think honesty is a good approach. If it's something that you haven't dealt with, just be honest and say, you know what, this is hard for you and this is hard for me too. But just reaffirm that you're there to support them. I love you, I care for you. I'm here to support you. And just reaffirming your position in their life and how much you are there to just be a supportive person or in their life and in this hard situation they're probably going through.
Excellent. And that goes along that last couple of slides I talked about. Be honest with your child if you've never experienced that, and that you're going to do whatever you can to be supportive and be there. Absolutely correct, Veronica. We did get another question in the chat. I'm going to throw it actually there, and I will turn it over to my graduate students because I do know some of you have dealt with this. This is a hot topic right now where students are, how do you handle when child talks about a peer talking about self-harm? We know that self-harm is very similar to suicide in that kids learn from each other, those bad coping strategies. So how do you talk to kids about that? What would you guys recommend? Because you guys are doing so awesome.
I think there's I know there's an app called Stop It, and that's for bullying, but I'm sure it can be also used for, yes, Stop It, to report another student that is going through these feelings or doing these, or participating in self-harm, and it's completely anonymous, but definitely I would make sure it's reported to the counselor, and the counselor can investigate that at school and then refer them to outside sources if needed, resources.
Excellent. Yeah, and if you know the parent, you could call the parent and let them know that this is what I heard. I don't know if it's true, but just want to give you a heads up. But I think Lily's approach is definitely, if you want to kind of be more confidential about it, contact the counselors at the school and make them aware so that they can follow up with that student at school. Because again, they're going to be the line of defense during that time that children are in school. And I would also to educate your child, have that conversation with them about self-harm and, put it back on them. How do you feel about your friend talking about self-harm? Is this something that you've considered? Is this something you've done before? Is this something you want to do? Right? So talk to your children and educate them. If they ask you a question that's like, whoa, or they really, it crosses your mind that, that they might be thinking about it, but find out more information about why their friends even telling them, because they do learn self-harm from each other. That is definitely, in all the research. And if there's any other, or you can put it in the chat. I hope I answered your question. That's a great question. We are dealing with that too as well up north. So, and the body image and all that stuff. Andy, did you get any other questions that came through the chat? Yeah, and social media influences. Anybody want to I know I'm sure we're all dealing with that one. That one's a much harder one to track. Anybody have any issues with that? I do know that most, if not all now, at least the popular, right, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, have a reporting number or website where parents can go on, or anybody for that matter, can go on and report inappropriate messages and ask them to take those messages down. Your child, you should empower your child also to directly tell the person that's writing about them if it is something that is being like cyberbullied. They should report that or tell that person that they need to take it down, that you do not approve of that. They obviously need to tell an adult. An adult should report that. And they also have legal means to seek legal, you can make a police report if your child is being harassed on social media. But a great direct way is just to contact that media source and give them the name, the username of whoever is putting things on there. And it may not even be directed at your child. If you come across something like they're telling kids how to kill themselves or, how to harm themselves, report it and let them do their investigation. Because, right, we can't tell everybody in the world to get off social media. We'd be quite busy. We'd be, unfortunately, yes, that's a tough one. And they always say don't respond, right? Don't egg on the person if there is a cyberbullying situation. Try to cut that off and go around that, report it, and definitely, as an adult, make sure you're monitoring your children and what they're seeing on social media. There's a lot of mean people out there, unfortunately. Thank you so much for attending. I really appreciate it. Thank you, thank you. Thank you for coming. We are at 8:03. Is there any final questions that we can answer or I can answer? I will stay on last with Andi to make sure everybody is, like we say, zipped up. Thank you so much.